Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Thursday night. It has been a busy day in Minnesota when it comes to the story that absolutely dominates all others in our coverage, and that is the story of fraud. Day by day, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And Lou Raguse has been on it since the beginning. Lou, today, what we heard is staggering.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about it.
Well, this was a wide-ranging press conference held by First Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson. He used to be the acting U.S. Attorney, but now he has a new title, and it's First Assistant U.S. Attorney.
He calls a press conference today.
He's the lead prosecutor on all of these fraud cases, which began with the Feeding Our Future meal fraud case.
Okay.
And so the point of the press conference today was to announce new charges in fraud cases and give an overview of the scope of the fraud investigations, which what amounted to telling us how much they think the fraud totals up to.
Let's start with that second part, because I think that's kind of zooming out over the entire investigation. There's been consternation, accusations online of who's reporting the real number of fraud. You and I talked about it on the Plus last week for a half an hour. And today, Joe Thompson says they suspect a significant portion of around $18 billion paid to Medicaid in Minnesota was fraud.
Yeah, and so where that number comes from is there are 14 programs in Minnesota that are being scrutinized as being what the state calls high risk of fraud. It's like these are the programs where they're finding the fraud. So these 14 programs are basically on probation right now, and they're not approving new providers in them, and they are holding back payments from certain providers within them to try to figure out the fraud. Of those 14 programs, since 2018, those programs have paid out $18 billion. Then the question then becomes, what percentage of that $18 billion is fraudulent? And that was a primary question that I and other reporters were trying to get Joe Thompson to reveal. Like, what do you really think here? And they don't know for sure because they haven't totally figured it out and arrested all the people and stuff like that. But he gave his estimate eventually by saying that he thinks that up to half of that is fraud, which would total $9 billion, which is absolutely staggering.
With that kind of figure, even if it's just a third, let's say it's even $6 billion.
I would say anything over than the $1 or $2 billion that we talked about a week or two ago would
was high,
be
we
huge.
thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you have to remember how much a billion is 1,000 million. Okay.
Thank you.
And then multiply that. It's hard to figure out where that money came from and where it's going. Really.
People are pissed. Regular Minnesota taxpayers.
I hear it all the time.
And this isn't money that we expect to really get back.
No. They gave an update on that, and they said, for the fraud cases, primarily Feeding Our Future, they've gotten back about $60 million so far.
Wow. So they were saying things like, what we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes. Joe Thompson said it is swamping Minnesota. The magnitude of this fraud cannot be overstated. We are seeing programs that are completely and entirely fraudulent.
Yep.
I mean, these are all, each sentence on its own is a damning statement.
Right. And what I would say is, obviously, you have to always scrutinize public figures, and the same goes for Joe Thompson. But also, he hasn't been known to exaggerate, and he made a point of saying that. Like, I don't come to these conclusions and make these statements lightly. And so, when I hear him say something like that, it hits a little bit different than if I hear somebody else who has more of a political motivation.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. We should remind people, Joe Thompson didn't run for this office. There's not an R or a D next to his name.
Yeah.
That's just
He's
not what
a
this
civil
is.
servant, basically,
Right.
as a prosecutor. And so when he what he was getting at, my impression of what he was getting at is people have a tendency to explain away things like these programs are mostly good, and there's just these few bad actors, and they're just the bad guys, and everything else is fine. And he's basically saying, no, these programs are by and large being looted.
You know what's interesting about that? I know you don't cover politics, but I also sit next to you and know you follow it very closely. Last week, when Governor Walz named a gentleman to basically be the fraud czar of Minnesota and find all of where the I's aren't dotted, where the T's aren't crossed. That person came up very soberingly, said, I'm not here to serve Tim Walz. I'm not here to serve either party. I'm here to find
Yeah, and that's really what the state needs.
And that's kind of what Joe Thompson is doing here.
And Joe Thompson makes it clear, too, that you can't prosecute your way out of it because he said, we look backwards.
Right.
We handle the things that have already been done. It's not our job at the U.S. Attorney's Office to look forward and try to prevent things. And, at the state level, it needs to be a combination.
So in that same press conference, Governor Walz seemed to get a little bit agitated when he kept being asked because he referenced that
Joe Thompson?
Tim Walz last week.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He was getting a little bit agitated last week when he was getting follow-up questions about people that had left their jobs that he said they did well in their jobs, but they just didn't fit where we were going with fraud. It very much, reading the tea leaves, felt like they needed to be out, but he didn't fire them. And I think a lot of people, too, are like, why weren't people fired about this?
Just as a reporter, I found that strange because I covered Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York when I worked in Buffalo for 3 years. And the way that Cuomo would handle something like that, even when he's very much at fault for a lot of things, he would just say, that person's fired because they did something wrong and they're out of here and we're moving forward. That's kind of like one way I've seen politicians handle it. The way that Walz handles it, in some ways, is very Minnesotan, where you don't want to say anything bad about anybody, really, and there's a lot of insinuation. And so, but as a reporter, then that becomes confusing because you're like, well, what do you really mean about this?
Right.
And if it's confusing to us, it must be confusing to our viewers as well.
Right. It's why I bring it up.
But the thing that you brought up is, so the former commissioner of the Department of Human Services, Jody Harpstead, as late as January, was testifying at a hearing, and she said there's more rumors of fraud than there is real fraud in DHS. And that obviously is a completely disproven statement at this point, especially when you're looking at $18 billion being paid out in these programs and the chief prosecutor estimating that up to half of it was fraud.
Unbelievable. When this number was said today, even again, if we're being conservative and say it's just half, if it's $9 billion or $6 billion, that's still triple what we talked about last week. Does this number surprise you?
Yeah, it does. Because, and it also surprises me because, and it's a little frustrating because they'll never be able to charge enough people to show that it was $9 billion. It would take huge teams, and they have really a surprisingly small team at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota. And there were some challenging questions from some reporters of like, well, how long until you charge $1 billion? And Joe Thompson's answer was as long as it takes. But the reality is like, I think that at the state they need to, through their audits and so forth, figure out. Because even if you can't prove this person guilty, you can still see that there's fraud there. If there's double billing going on, the paperwork tells you that it's fraud, not a conviction in court. So there's a difference between criminal liability for fraud and evidence of fraud.
Right.
And I think that's what the people of Minnesota, they want both, obviously.
Right.
But a clearer answer, and Joe Thompson's trying to do that from his position.
Right. How much is gone? What am I really looking at?
There were a lot of good questions today, including, is Minnesota unique or is this going on everywhere? And he said Minnesota is very much unique. In fact, 2 people who were charged today took part in what he called fraud tourism because they're from Philadelphia. They heard about how easy it is to defraud Minnesota. They came here, rented out an office, signed up a bunch of people for housing stabilization, which is probably the most defrauded program, made all this money, basically filled their reimbursements out back in Philadelphia, and stole Minnesota's money from their homes in Philly.
Get the fraud out. Get the fraud out. That's what I was going to say. Wow. First I've heard of that.
Yep. That was a new one today. Autism fraud is another one I've been covering pretty closely. The first person to be charged in that, Asha Hassan, pleaded guilty today. That was the first. That's how the day started. And then a relative of hers who was also implicated was charged today. So now there's only been 2 people charged in what looks to be, if you look at these graphs and how much the money really started flying out of the DHS in the last couple of years, just 2 people, one guilty and one just charged in what is expected to be a pretty big fraud case.
And that's what you were there for, in addition to the big picture of here's the amount of money we're thinking about right now, and then the charges and all. And so that, to me, is a great way to explain to the folks watching that this is ongoing. This is like the leaky faucet that you've called every plumber in the damn state of Minnesota, and it won't stop, and sometimes it gushes.
Yeah.
And how long is that going to go on for?
Well, I've had some political figures tell me on the phone that they feel like feeding our future is old news. Well, technically, yes, it was first announced in 2022, but it very much continues today. And that was just the beginning of it. You know, as those trials happen, you might have thought that this fraud thing is, coming to an end here. It was really just the beginning.
So when does it end? I mean,
it'll be years down the road until, all the cases have been charged and all these people have had their day in court. I mean, we can hope that in October, when they started to scrutinize these 14 programs, that the fraud by and large was turned off. That would be our hope, but it remains to be seen if that is true.
Right, and to point out what Joe Thompson said, what you will see charged is going to be things that did happen back then. So the whammy on the political side, if you are the sitting governor who's trying to win a third term, is it doesn't matter if you have the fraud czar in place now or you have this person in place now. The Minnesota voter is going to hear about this on an almost weekly basis through next year's election.
And, to put on, a political hat for a second, it's how much credit will the voters give Governor Walz for the changes that he's making now versus how much they punish him for what happened before now.
Yeah, and that's the political question that nobody has a definitive answer to. Well, Lou Raguse, quite the day in all of your fraud work. Thanks for joining us on BTN Plus tonight.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll probably be back with Lou again soon. Thanks for watching. Take care.